welcome to this presentation. I'm Don Corleone, and today we're going to talk about how to misplay your nut advantage. Now, this is a bit of a funny name. In reality, we want to look at what kinds of mistakes are common depending on the composition of your range. If you have a big nut advantage, if you don't have a nut advantage, in order to not make those mistakes, and also in order to detect those mistakes in our opponents and take advantage of them. So, what are we going to learn? We're going to learn about mistakes that you're probably making already, since it's actually very, very difficult to not misplay in this way, because we're talking about playing in a way that's range aware, right? It's very, I want to say it's easy, but it's easier to look at your hand and look at your blockers and look at your suits and see, oh, there's a heart, there's a diamond, there's an ace, and make decisions based off of that, or even the RNG, right? Looking at the RNG, whatever the RNG says, you do. All those things are easier because they are immediate visual stimuli that you're seeing, but that's not how you should play. So we're going to talk about those mistakes. We're going to talk about how to fix your strategy to a certain extent. Of course, you're always going to make mistakes. We're going to talk about how to detect and keep track of other people's mistakes in this regard and how to take advantage. So let's talk about the nut advantage. Nut advantage is the excess of high equity hands in a range, more or less. If you have a lot more good hands, then you have a nut advantage. It dictates sizings, it dictates frequencies, and it dictates what kind of approach you're going to have to a certain spot. If you have a more polar range or more of a nut advantage, your strategy is going to be more proactive. You need to make things happen. Whereas when you don't have a nut advantage at all, imagine the extreme scenario where your range is really, really weak and not it at all, then you're going to have a more reactive strategy. In the more extreme example, you would just range check, for example, right? But in other less extreme examples, it might lead to smaller bets, a higher frequency of checking, etc. So what are the features of a polar range? And a polar range is a range that has a lot of nutted hands and not a lot of middling hands, right? Now, when I talk about polar ranges and condensed ranges and all these things in this presentation, I don't mean that in the most extreme sense. I'm not talking about like a range composed of nuts and air or a range composed of only bluff catchers. I'm going to compare similar lines somewhat, but where there's a key difference that makes one range be more polar than the other or more condensed than the other. So the features of a polar range are going to be, we're going to be fast playing strong hands mainly. There's, in real scenarios, in real poker scenarios, there's rarely a case where we have a completely polar range. So usually there's always going to be some slow playing going on. But when we have a more polar range, there's going to be a lot less slow playing. We're going to play more direct sizings, meaning, for example, you have a hand that has like 99% equity or 100% equity. Those are the spots where you see those hands just shoving for 3, 4, 5, 6 times the pot on the river because you're just sizing for your hand. Basically, you're targeting bluff catchers by polarizing your bet size the most. And not necessarily a high betting frequency. Now, you can have a high betting frequency the more of a nut advantage that you have, but a polar range could be polar in terms of having like one nutted hand per 10 bluffs, right? That would be a very low betting frequency, but it would still be a polar range. But a higher nut advantage, imagine a case where you have maybe five nutted hands and 5 bluffs in your range, that would be a much, much, much higher betting frequency, right? So what are the features of a condensed range? And again, I don't mean like a completely condensed range necessarily, but more condensed than average. We're going to be slow playing strong hands more, right? We're going to be using trappy sizings, and this could be blocking with a really strong hand on the river, for example. And slow playing doesn't necessarily mean checking, going off of the last point. Sometimes blocking can be a trap, but even bigger sizings can also be traps, right? If your hand is worth all of the chips in your opponent's stack and you bet 3/4 pot, in a certain way, you're trying to get raised. You're hoping that your opponent does something. You're trapping him into doing something, even though you bet bigger, right? So let's do this quiz. The board is this one, 984 rainbow, 2, 2, and it's blind versus blind single raise spot. The flop goes check, check, and then we're going to bet a third on the turn out of position. We get called, and then on river, it's a question mark about what we're going to do. So let me pull the vote. So with overpair plus, are we going to check or block 10% of the time, 20% of the time, 40% of the time, or 60% of the time? Okay, this is a case, again, where we are blind versus blind in a single raise spot. We check out of position on the flop, goes check, check. We bet a third on the turn, we get called, and then a river. What are we going to do with overpair plus? Which, by the way, overpair plus here is really, 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 really strong, obviously. So let's see. The answer is 60%. And the reason why is our range is, again, when I say condensed or mergy or linear or these things, I'm not saying in an absolute sense. Of course, we're betting the turn and we're getting called. So we do have some nut advantage to some extent, right? But we have more of a middling hand based range, because the story that we're telling when we bet small on the turn is the story that we have an 8 or 4 or a pair of 5s. That's the story that we're telling, right? And in poker, theoretically, whenever you take a line that tells a story, that story should mostly be true most of the time. Not always, otherwise your hand will become face up, but the story should mostly be true, right? Lois asks, how much do overpairs check to check raise or bet bigger on the turn? Is it significant enough that the amount of overpairs in this branch is small relative to the other branches? Yes. And that's the point, right? We're taking a line that is saying we don't have a super strong hand. We more so have a middling hand, a middle pair, that hand, right? That's what we're telling in our story. Now, it's not always true. We're sometimes going to have an overpair. We're sometimes going to have boats. We're sometimes going to have those kinds of things, but not at a very high frequency, right? And because we have such a low frequency of those good hands, they need to be protecting the more middling hands, right? Your goal when you have a middling hand is really to get to showdown, right? And if your hand is face up, you're not really going to get to showdown if your opponents are good. Right? If you're face up, your opponents are just going to put so much pressure onto you that you're not going to be able to reach showdown effectively. So let's talk about the first mistake, which is telegraphing a face-up range. So playing each hand in a vacuum in the most straightforward way and not having enough traps in a spot where our range should have a decent amount of traps. All right, so we're in this spot, check, check, bet a third on turn, and we see that there's a split between a overbet and a block, and there we get to the river, we have 3 options: block, 3/4, and overbet. And let's look a little bit at the ranges that get to the river. So first of all, on the flop we checked. That already is telling a story, right? That already is saying that we don't have an overpair. Is that story always true? No, but it's mostly true. We're not going to have most overpairs in this line, right? So that's already a kind of condensing action. And then when we block on the turn, you see how, again, most of the hands that are blocking are these kinds of 8x, right? These kinds of bat 9x, 7s. Right? That's the story that we're telling so far. So when we get to the river, our range is not really betting big that often. It's betting like a normal size or a block or checking wide a bit of the time, right? So if we look at overpair plus, we see that it's slow playing at least about 60% of the time, right? And that's not even correct. Like there's more slow playing because, for example, when you bet these sizings with 9s, the bigger sizings, it's also a slow play, right? When you bet a normal size with 9s or even overbet, it's still kind of a trap because 9s there is super nutted, right? But yeah, we're basically slow playing a lot. Now, the way in which people are going to make a mistake here is if you are the kind of person that just looks at your hand and decide, okay, my hand is worth this amount, right? Let's say you get here with, or you do hit trips, And you go, okay, I overbet with trips because it's trips, right? Or you get here with a set of eights and you hit a boat in the river. And you're like, okay, I have a boat. I have a really strong hand. Let me just overbet because it's a really, really good hand, right? That is a mistake. Now, am I saying you shouldn't ever do that? No. Okay? Whenever I talk about mistakes in poker, I don't care so much about you making the mistake or not. But when you make it, you should know that it's a deviation. You should know that you're doing something a little bit naughty, right? And you should be very sensitive to other people making the same kinds of mistakes so you can not allow them to make those mistakes. That asks, anybody know if this is simple or simplified settings? It's the AI solve. So the preflop ranges are the ones that are only preflop, and then the postflop is just the AI. So how do we play that in a better way? Well, the first thing we need to realize is that our range is not very polar, right? How? What are the little hints that we need to look at? Well, the first hint is the line that we took, right? We checked the flop, and actually the biggest point is the fact that we bet a third on the turn. The fact that we bet a third on the turn is telling a very strong story, and the story that you don't tell is as important or more than the story that you do tell. So we're saying the story that we're telling is not that we have a really strong hand, right? So we have a fairly condensed-ish range, and therefore we need to have a lot of slow plays, right? So that's the first thing that you need to look at, the line and also the texture. Now, in this case, the two doesn't really change much, but sometimes the texture can make you more polarized or less polarized, right? So after we've established that there need to be a lot of slow plays here, we need to start looking at blockers, right? Theoretically, at least. The solver is going to look at blockers. So, for example, aces is checking a lot because our opponent, when we check to him, is mostly not going to bet with an ace. So when we have aces, we are blocking his checkbacks and therefore unblocking his value bets and his bluffs, right? Same with a hand like ace deuce, kind of the same thing. We're unblocking his bets for value and as a bluff, and we're blocking his checkbacks, right? Those hands are checking for that reason. Then a hand like eights, for example, is blocking because if you bet big with a hand like eights, you're not going to get called much because you're blocking the eight that would call you, right? But if you block, you get raised a lot by a 9, right? So it's a little bit of a tricky blocker play where you get raised by a 9 and you get called by a 4. That's why you block with 8s. And then with 9s, it's betting bigger. I've talked about this before. There's a little rule of thumb that we can use to get to a decent conclusion faster. It's called the lookalike principle. I think Goosecore coined it, if I'm not mistaken. But basically, what the lookalike principle says is that you should play nutted hands the same way you would play a hand that's not nutted that shares a blocker with it. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, but the short version is that if we have 8s, we need to play kind of like if we had 1-8. Right? So here, if we look at the second pair here, you see that it's mostly blocking, but then a little bit of checking. Right? Well, so when you have 2 8s, you mostly block, but a little bit of checks. Top pair, you see it's mostly betting big, sometimes overbetting, sometimes blocking, sometimes checking, and that's how 9s are playing. That's the lookalike principle. And then aces look like ace high. Ace 2 looks like ace high. And then queen 2 kind of looks like anything because the queen doesn't really interact much with valence range in a very specific way. So that's the lookalike principle. Now, there are real blocker reasons, like what I was talking about before. Like when you have 8s, if you block, you get raised by a 9, you get called by a 4. Right? That's the real logical reason. But the rule of thumb gets you to the same conclusion most of the time. So that's how you should play in that regard. Now, what happens if your opponent is not doing that? What happens if your opponent, you see him, actually you are paying attention to his showdowns, and you see him get here with aces, or hit a 2 on the river, or have 8s, right? and you see him overbet those hands, right? Or quad. Well, he doesn't really have quads, but what happens in that case? Well, let's actually look at that. Let's no luck, and let's set the strategy, and let's just make him overbet those hands. Ace deuce, queen deuce, maybe aces, eights, do those hands, and let's lock everything, and with no luck, let's see what happens. Now, when he checks, well, this is pretty funny, but we are 10x shoving the river 13% of the time. Right? And our betting frequency is very high overall, but we're 10x shoving the river with a 2, with bluffs, with even queen 9 is just 10x shoving the river for value. Right? That's a very, very extreme deviation. If we compare to the original strategy, we see that our frequency has gone up by a lot. And I mean, obviously, there weren't many 10x shoves in the regular sim. Right now, there's a lot of 10x shoves. Another thing that we're doing is we're bluffing probably a little bit more than before. So now with no made hand, the betting frequency is a lot higher than before. And that's, so we're bluffing more, we're bluffing bigger, and we're also going thinner for value and bigger for value. That's the deviation. That's how you take advantage of someone who has a condensed range, but doesn't protect it properly. Soto says, so basically, when he can't have the nuts, we can go nuts. Yes, that's exactly what that means. Are we raising a lot more versus block as well? Yes, we are raising 28% of the time, or a pretty high amount, 25% of the time. And we're raising huge all-in, a decent portion of it, right? We're taking even any top pair and raising even some second pair is indifferent to raising for value. And then we're bluffing a lot. We're going big as compared to the original node. And we see that our frequency has gone up and also our sizing has gone up by a lot. Okay. So basically, what I'm getting at is if your opponent's range is condensed and you see, based on his showdowns or his playstyle, you see that the good hands are not put in that line, right? The really strong hands are not in that line. Then you should basically, as Soto said, when he can't have the nuts, you should go nuts. So let's do another quiz. Blind versus blind single spot. So it's the same board, but now the line changes. Okay, now we are betting 100 on flop, betting 117 on turn, and then a river, question mark. Are we checking? Now, a little hint, we're not going to be blocking in this line pretty much ever, or betting really small at all. Are we going to check with overpairs 5% of the time? Are we going to check 10% of the time with overpair plus, by the way, boats and all those things? 10% of the time, 20% of the time, or 33% of the time? So the answer is 5%. You guys got it right? And the reason is, well, now the story that we're telling is very different, right? We are betting big on flop, big on turn. And the story we're telling is that we actually do have an overpair, right? That's what we're saying. We do have an overpair. We don't, think about the run out as well. We don't really have hands in this line that would want to bet small or check in order to get to showdown. Right? We don't have 8x. We barely have 9x, right? If we take this line with a 9, it's going to be a pretty good 9. We don't have a lot of those middling hands, and therefore we're not going to have a lot of checks that need to be protected, because remember, protecting the check-in range or protecting the small bet range only matters as long as you have middling hands in that range. Middling hands want to get to showdown. If you have air, if you bet the flop with air, bet the turn with air, and then check the river, that doesn't need to be protected. That hand is worth nothing, okay? You shouldn't try to protect hands that are worth nothing. So let's talk about the second mistake, which is slow playing too much with a polar range. Okay? This is common for people who RNG or use blockers to slow play with the nuts, right? The same way that we looked at the spot before and we talked about how to play with blockers in order to have enough slow plays. If you do that, if you apply that here, it's just going to be wrong because you don't have those middling hands in range. Okay. So as we can see, now the story is completely different. The story we're telling is we do have an overpair or a strong 9, Then on the turn, we're continuing the same story, set, to pair, etc. Notice that even on the turn, we're not slow playing a lot. Okay? Even on the turn, we're not slow playing a lot with really strong hands. And the reason is because on the flop, we are already polarizing our range. Okay, RNGing too much on the turn with sets and whatnot would already be a mistake in of itself because we already have a polar range. But by the time we get to the river, it's even more polar. We get to the river, and then we look at overpair plus, we see is about a 5% checking range. Not a lot of checks, and not a lot of smaller than all-in bets. The one hand that is checking is nines. Because if you are going to have one hand that checks, it would be nines. Because your opponent is mostly going to check back with 9x in this line. It's not the same as the other one, where a 9 was very, very strong. Here, a 9 is not as strong. So here, blocking checkbacks is done with 2 9s. And also thinking about the lookalike principle, right? If we have a 9 here, we would mostly check, as we can see here. Therefore, we check with 9s. And you might say, well, but same with 8s, right? But like, why don't you check with 8s if it has a very, very similar blocker profile, let's say? Well, the reason is because we don't really have 8x in this range, right? This is what you need to remember. If you RNG or you play with blockers and do this because you have a heart or you have an 8 or you have this or you have that, your ranges are going to end up being super imbalanced, right? You first need to think about what your range looks like overall. And in this case, if you think about it, if you look at the line and the run out, your range is extremely polar. You don't really have a lot of middling hands that want to check the river. You don't really have a lot of middling hands that want to bet small or river. And therefore, your very strong hands should only slow play a fraction of the time. All right. Now, what happens when someone doesn't do this? What happens if someone decides to check with 8s, check with 4s, check with aces, or maybe even check with kings without a diamond? Because, I mean, why not? You're unblocking bluffs. Your opponent could have jack 10, 7-6, diamonds. It's a very human way of playing to get to this river and think that if you check, you're going to get over bluffed. So let's no lock and let's do something like this guy's going to be checking with aces. This guy's going to be checking with 8s, with 4s, maybe with, maybe we could keep it like that and we'll see what happens. Right? So what happens now when they check? And let's compare this to the original. And we see that our frequency and our sizing has gone lower. For example, now we are not value betting with Queen 9. Value betting with King 9 is indifferent. King 9 and Ace 9 in the original sim can go all in. Here, they can't go all in. And then we're overall not bluffing big as often, right? When we get here with like 7-5, we're mostly bluffing small, 7-6, whereas before we were mostly bluffing big, okay? So that's the problem with these spots. If you are just looking at your visual cues in the cards that you're holding, you're going to end up playing in an imbalanced way. Is that the worst if your opponents don't do anything about it? No, but you should try to be the opponent that does something about it, okay? So, to conclude this section, verse 2 polar passive lines, okay? Range that's too polar, that's taking a passive line with too many slow plays. What we want to do is bluff for small sizings, right? You might say, well, but why would we bluff at all if they have a lot of nutted hands? It might be the case that they have enough air in the range for us to get enough folds, right? If that's the case, then we should still bluff, but we should bluff small, targeting air, not big, targeting bluff catchers, because that's just going to run into good hands too often. When we face small bets from a range that has too many good hands, we should play closer to call or fold, right? We shouldn't bluff raise that much versus a range that is just too polar. And we should also value raise not as thin. So less value raises, less bluff raises, and also don't go thin for value. Okay? Verse 2 capped passive lines. This one is pretty obvious, right? We're going to bluff for big sizings, and we're going to be targeting bluff catchers mainly, as we saw in the previous sims. we're going to play a lot of thin value and bluff raises. So of course, it's the opposite. Right? If we face a block bet that is too face up, doesn't contain the strong hands that it should, we should raise very thin for value, and we should bluff raise big and often. Now, the question is, how do you detect these leads? Right? Do you just assume that everyone makes them, or do you play in a certain specific way against population, or do you look at the hot stats, or what do you do? Well, everything it can be used, like the hot stats or general population tendencies, can be used in order to detect these leaks. But I would say that the main way is going to be showdowns, because basically this is, for example, with hot stats, this is difficult to gather data on, right? You might see someone who check falls on the river too much. Okay, that might mean that his checks have too few slow plays, sure. But a lot of these things are very specific, very low sample. You're not going to have a lot of data on. So what you will have is showdowns. Now, to make use of showdowns, we need to be taking notes. If we don't take notes, we're going to forget. Even if you think you're so smart, you're not going to forget. You will eventually forget, okay? I promise you. So we need to take notes. Now, a few tips to take notes. First one is keep your notes basic and easy to read, okay? A lot of people have really complex systems for taking notes where there's all of these things that they take notes on. The problem with that is that whenever you open them in game, you're going to just read a bunch of letters and be like, what am I reading? I'm just overwhelmed, right? So keep your notes basic and easy to read. Have 2 or 3 main points, right? You can have a lot of complex notes as long as there's a clear distinction between the more actionable points in your notes and the more just keeping track of things. Right, so you could have you could take notes on your opponents, or you have like 10 lines of notes, but there should be 2 or 3 main points that are clearly delineated as the most important ones. Right? Maybe in all caps, maybe separated by a line, something like that. An example of one of these points could be face-up sizings, too trappy, very simple and basic and to the point. And this is because when you're playing, you need to be to the point. You can't spend 3 minutes reading a note. Now, a mistake that I see a lot of people make is they take note on the wrong showdown, okay? For example, in the first example that we gave, it's blind versus blind, 9-8, something, right? And we go check, check, block turn, and block river, right? Let's say you call and you see your opponent had an 8. Wow, that's a face-up hand. Well, not really. He just played the hand in the most logical way for his particular strategy, right? He just played an 8 in a reasonable way. Does that mean that his range is capped or face up? Not necessarily. It could be that he slow plays enough good hands in that line. So the fact that he told a story that is true doesn't mean that he has leaked necessarily. The point at which you would know that those lines are too capped is actually when you see him take a line with strong value that's different. This is why notes are important, because to make the exploit when he has a middling hand, you actually have to remember what he does with a strong hand, which is going to be a different line, right? This is why you need to take notes on it. This is just a completely different line, right? Maybe you saw him block the turn and then overbet the river with a set of 8s. Okay, wow. That's a line that is very direct. Sizing, he played as if he had a polar range, but in reality, 8s shouldn't play so directly. They should slow play more in that line. Okay, I'm going to take a note of that. He's actually face up with size. Okay? So in this case, that showdown would be fast played with a very capped range. Another type of showdown would be the opposite, which is when you see him slow play with a very polar range. Right? You see him represent a range where he goes like overbet, and then a river he blocks out of position with top set. He did it because of blockers, or he did it because of whatever reason. But in reality, he's not really telling a consistent story. His hand there seems to be just a slow play, right? And therefore, you should take note of that. And remember to not raise as thin, to not be aggressive with bluff raises against that guy in those sorts of lines, that type of stuff. So, to summarize, we need to keep track of showdowns to be able to effectively exploit these leaks. The main leaks are going to be someone who's too trappy with a polar range. The other league is going to be someone who's 2 face up with a capped range versus 2 trappy of a range. We're going to bluff small. We're going to play closer to call or fold versus bets. And we're not going to go thin for value. And versus a 2 face up range, we're going to bluff big and often. We're going to go thinner for value. And we're going to be bluff raising a lot, right? So if you have any further questions, make sure to ask them in chat. And yeah, guys, see you next one. And thanks for watching. And yeah, see you.